Now we're going to talk a little bit about how things are evolving globally and what's happening in the international markets. And perhaps the best expert to come join us and talk about that is Eric Ottaway, the CEO of Brooklyn Brewery. Brooklyn Brewery is the 11th largest craft brewery in the United States, and Eric has been leading the organization since 2014. And prior to taking over as CEO, he served as the Chief Operating Officer. And he runs the business alongside with his brother, Robin, who serves as the brewery's president. And they've been with the company since the mid-'90s, so they've seen a lot of change here in the U.S. and in international markets where I think they're sold in like 30 countries. They have, I think, 7 different international partnerships with craft brewers, and I'd be willing to bet that Eric spends more time abroad than he does here in the U.S. these days because of all of his partnerships. So we're going to chat with him about what's going on internationally, how the Brooklyn business is going here in the U.S., how he sees the craft space evolving, and it should be pretty fun. The other great part about this conversation is that my colleague Justin is going to come up here and conduct the interview alongside me, and we're actually going to recast this interview as part of our new podcast at the end of December. So this will be my shameless plug. If you guys haven't downloaded the podcast yet or subscribed, we are available everywhere that you listen to podcasts. So iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, Google Play, Libsyn, SoundCloud. You can find us if you guys listen to podcasts. It's just the Brewbound podcast. And you'll be able to hear this interview with Eric again at the end of December. So with that, I will call up Justin Kendall and Eric Ottaway. Come on up to the stage, guys.
Chris.
Good to see you. All right. Welcome to the Brewbound podcast.
Thank you. You're really going to make these people listen to me twice?
Yes, yeah. Well, for all the people that couldn't make it to Santa Monica, we want to make sure that they have a chance to hear you.
Okay, fair enough.
And we'll tell those listeners to come to Santa Monica in 2019 so that they can see you live and in the flesh.
All the cheap plugs.
Yeah. I mean, this is my one chance to plug it. So I sort of mentioned it in the intro. You know, you guys have always had this international focus, but over the last couple years, things have really ramped up, and you've really emphasized the global partnerships. And I think I said 7 international craft partners. I hope I didn't get that wrong. And that's not including the minority sale to Kirin in 2016. So first and foremost, how's that partnership going with Kirin? And what have you learned? And where are things at today?
Sure. It's actually been a lot of fun getting to know the Kirin family. It's like sort of marrying into new family and then slowly over a number of holidays and vacations kind of meeting the extended family that's out there and discovering all these second and third cousins twice removed that are really, really interesting people.
Have you found the crazy uncle yet?
I have not found a crazy uncle yet, but we have kind of discovered all kinds of nooks and crannies and corners of the business that do really, really interesting things. Sometimes we've run into them on purpose, and other times completely accidentally, like at a conference in the U.S. where they're presenting something that they do that we didn't know about. But it's been really gratifying to have such a great kind of long-term focused partner who's willing to talk to us about any number of things and make their resources available. So, one of the things that Kirin is one of the larger breweries in the world, but also a little less than half their business is in the pharmaceutical side. If that's the way the world goes and pharma becomes sort of a component of what we all do, then it's nice to know that we have somebody that knows a little something about that part of the world.
Yeah, we have a question about that, obviously, and there was some news just recently that they're getting more involved in that space.
They're definitely getting more involved, and I think we had talked before this, and you'd said that the headline was a little bit bombastic, that they're de-emphasizing beer. But tell me a little bit about that health and wellness space that they're moving into, and how that'll relate to Brooklyn.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to speak for them, obviously, and they're a public listed company, so I can't make statements on their behalf. But I mean, certainly, they've seen the same trends that everybody else is seeing, and they already have a number of investments in the health and wellness space, and they like what they see, and they're going to put more resources behind that. So we're having some really interesting conversations with some of those people as we look at what else should be happening in beer.
What's the market opportunity for functional alcoholic beverages?
I don't even know that it's necessarily just functional alcoholic. I think it's just functional beverage. And whether you approach it from an alcoholic or non-alcoholic standpoint or both remains to be seen. I think that opportunity is enormous. I mean, if you look at like the supplements business in this country, right? I don't have the exact numbers at my fingertips, but it's something like a $30 billion industry. Go into your average supermarket and look at the shelves, and there's usually like a half an aisle that's just like vitamins and supplements and all kinds of stuff. As a nation, certainly in the U.S., but increasingly globally, I mean, we spend more money on diet products and trying to improve ourselves in one way or the other, unfortunately, largely unsuccessfully, because I think we're approaching it wrong. But certainly the consumer is looking for ways to improve themselves, ways to improve their health, to live better. And I think that space is virtually unlimited.
And you see beer companies playing an increasing role in that space?
I think they can. I mean, as many people referenced earlier, this increasing blurring of the lines. I think we have to, and I'm going to, wherever you are, I thought you gave a great presentation, and I will thank you ahead once, but I will quote you then many times. I think with this blurring of the lines and thinking about what does it mean to be a beer company, I mean, I think we have to start thinking a lot bigger than that. And stop restricting ourselves to just beer. I mean, if you look at some of the more successful companies that operate in the brewing space, they're actually multi-beverage, multi-segment, multi-brand companies. I mean, one of the easiest examples in the beer space is look at Boston Beer Company. I mean, they're almost a bit misnamed now. And they're being so successful at the moment because 3 of their 4 main categories they play in are doing extremely well. But if they weren't in those other 3 categories, they would certainly look very different.
All non-beer.
What's
Absolutely.
that look like for Brooklyn then? How do you sort of apply that to yourself?
It means that we're, opening our minds about what we're going to be doing going forward and thinking about, is it with the same brand? Is it with new brands? What other categories do we want to get into? Do we start with the beer as a base? Do we, take a completely different angle at it? Nothing's off the table at the moment. I mean, I think in this day and age, you can't close your mind off to any possibility. I've been saying for a while, you almost never should you say never. Maybe never murder somebody, but aside from extreme examples, there's not too many things you should say never to because you just don't know where things are going to go.
Yeah. Are you able to experiment with some of these ideas in some of the international markets and what are you learning from being present in those markets, and how are you applying your knowledge to those markets?
Yeah, so one of the first ones we're doing, stepping outside of our more traditional area, is non-alcoholic. So in just a matter of days, we are launching our first non-alcoholic beer product in Europe, starting off in Sweden, actually, and then going from there. So it's something we've been working on for over a year, and are finally happy that we think we have a product that sits in the right place that we want it to be. And we're going to start in Europe because that's where obviously it's a much more penetrated segment right now. Some markets it's up to 10% of the market. In the U.S., obviously it's still tiny, but I think that's going to change. I think it's going to change rapidly. So we see opportunities here as well.
So how quickly will we see Brooklyn Lager Zero in the U.S.?
Well, it definitely won't be Brooklyn Lager Zero. That much I can tell you. But we're experimenting with a bunch of different products. There's different ways of going at non-alcoholic, and definitely in 2019 we'll start some market trials in the U.S. as well, and see what we learn as we go along in Europe and how we can apply those learnings to the U.S.
Yeah. When you start to think about the partnerships that you have in these global markets, I guess I'll take a step back and say, what are your sort of global craft aspirations? How do you see the global craft market evolving? And these partnerships that you've struck, how is that enabling Brooklyn Brewery to capitalize on all the opportunities that are out there?
Yeah, I mean, as craft has grown around the world, in this country, it's taken us, give or take, 40 years to get where we are now, but sort of the craft evolution is happening on a much more accelerated pace in most other countries because, they had sort of a roadmap, if you will, to follow, and we've enabled them to kind of proceed down that path much more quickly than they might otherwise. So, what we're seeing is really this kind of compression of that evolution in a lot of countries. It's almost like taking everything you've done and doing it in fast forward motion. And that's helped us. Our experience in the U.S. obviously has kind of helped us sort of foresee some of these things that are going to happen in other markets, like the proliferation and explosion of smaller breweries, the hyperlocal movements, all these kind of things, styles, and how those play out across lots of markets. So that's been very helpful for us. But the other thing we've learned is that it's really important to have local partnerships, people that understand. And have capabilities in distribution and marketing and sales. And it's very difficult to do that as a kind of small independent in a lot of those markets because the bigger brewers are even more dominant because there isn't the same three-tier system that we have in this country. So when you can write contracts with bars, that's great if you're on the inside of that system. It's terrible if you're on the outside of that system. So we've been lucky enough that we've managed to forge some good partnerships with relevant players overseas. So the biggest one of those is with Carlsberg. So if you look at Europe, there's essentially three main systems in Europe. You've got the Carlsberg system, the Heineken system, and the ABI system. And you can operate outside of it. There are some people that are doing that with some success, but relatively few, and it's a lot more difficult to go it on your own.
Yeah. Are you looking at adding more partnerships?
Nothing big. I mean, right now we're very happy with our, the two partners we have with Carlsberg and with Kirin. And just to be clear, there's no financial relationship with Carlsberg. We're just long-term, distribution partners with them. I don't know that we can handle many more than that. And between the two of them, we've got most of the world pretty well covered. So I don't think we're looking for really too many more larger scale partnerships like that.
Could we see more JVs, though, in the future?
Yeah, that's the other thing is, as kind of the craft beer world has evolved, being able to produce locally has become of that much more importance, both for sustainability reasons, for freshness reasons, for logistical reasons. We used to be shipping hundreds of containers, in every direction around the world every month, and that's just not sustainable in today's age. Particularly as beers get to be that much more hop forward and the styles we're brewing need to be that much fresher, you have to be brewing locally. And so what we found is in a lot of markets we were able to have a certain amount of success, and then as the craft beer movement caught up and there were just a lot more locally sourced, very fresh options, that unless we could really compete locally, produce locally, it was going to be a lot more difficult for us to continue to grow. So we're now brewing in, I think you said 6 or 7, that sounds about right, different locations around the world. But we're brewing in Sweden, in Norway, in Japan, in Australia, in Brazil, shortly in Canada, and South Korea, and probably a couple more after that in the next couple of years. So
sounds pretty easy.
Yeah, no, exactly. There's pluses and minuses to it. Obviously, one of the more complicated things is that now you have say Brooklyn Lager being produced in all these different locations. Well, if you want to tweak a recipe, it's not quite that easy. You just can't run downstairs and say, hey, let's switch out these hop sets. Now you got to do that across 7 or 8 different countries. And it's also a skill to learn to brew in multiple locations with multiple different breweries with different, sizes, shapes, capabilities, experiences, et cetera. So it's not as simple as just saying, here's our recipe, brew it, and it comes out the same. So there's been a lot of learning and figuring out how to work with all these different breweries and try to make sure that Brooklyn Lager tastes, the same everywhere we go.
But it probably tastes different in some cases because it's fresher, right?
Yeah, that's actually one of the few criticisms we received. As we've made this change, is people say, "Well, your beer tastes different," And we're like, yeah, it does, because actually now it tastes like it's supposed to, not like it's been around the world for 3 months. But that's a good problem to have. I'd rather be trying to explain that than the opposite.
So how much, I say export, and that's doing it a disservice, but how much of your sort of international export business makes up your total volume now?
Yeah, so I mean, our total export business is about half our business now, and by the end of 2019, about 75% of that would be produced overseas.
Wow, I mean that's pretty remarkable. What have you learned from being involved and entrenched in all these different markets? Is there sort of a common thread between them all? Like, are they all 5 to 10 years behind the U.S. in terms of development? Like, what's been the biggest sort of takeaway from being involved in so many different global markets?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say they're all at kind of different stages of their evolution. I think the most common thread is that the consumer around the world is doing the same kind of stuff. They're looking for differentiation. They're looking for authenticity. They're looking for variation in flavor and experiences, and they're continuing to evolve. The biggest thing is you can't just make one assumption and run with that for 5 years, because you'll find yourself in a completely different marketplace than you thought you were in. I think we've learned that pretty quickly, where a lot of markets where we were in for a number of years, all of a sudden we took our eye off the ball a little bit and realized, markets kind of got into a different place. So it's helped us as we go into new markets realize that you really have to stay on your toes, because things move extremely quickly and are moving faster than they did in this country.
Internally, what does that structure look like? How do you manage everything? Do you have one person who sort of oversees all the international efforts? Are there individual people in those markets? I mean, what does it look like?
Yeah, it's actually relatively few people in the company actually are directly involved in international. We have roughly 160 employees around the world, but only less than 20 of those are actually 100% focused on the international segment. My brother and I run the company, and he and I lead the international efforts. He focuses more on Asia. I focus more on Europe. And we don't have any full-time employees in Asia yet, but we do have 15 or so in Europe, and I think that'll continue to increase over time.
How much communication goes back and forth?
Oh, it's daily. It's constant.
It's constant.
Yeah, I mean, you have to stay totally integrated. You can't treat them like they're two different businesses, or soon you'll have two different brands. Mm-hmm. And actually, that's been some learning for us as we've gone along, is that while you're trying to sort of adapt and react to local market conditions, you have to still remember kind of where you came from and what the core of the brand is, because otherwise, all of a sudden, you discover that you're like trying to run two different companies, and that's not ideal.
Yeah. When you think about what's going on here in the U.S. with all the competition that we've talked about, do you almost see the international opportunities for craft to be, in a way, like a more viable option for growth for a lot of businesses here domestically?
No, actually, it's the opposite. I think there was a window of opportunity overseas, and I think that window is largely closed because so much local craft has developed
in those markets.
In those markets, yeah. I mean, they've done a good job of emulating what we did in this country, and like I said earlier, just doing it much more rapidly. So I think that I'm not saying there's zero opportunity, but I don't see any big opportunities to crack into those markets. It's one thing to sort of sprinkle a little bit of beer around a few countries and export. It's another thing to actually sell a meaningful amount of beer overseas. And it's like going into a new state, but times 10. It's that much further away, it's that much more expensive, it's that much different regulatory systems, different cultures, different traditions. So it takes a big investment to do it. It's not something you just casually do unless, like I said, you're just content with having a little bit of beer here and there.
So why are you doing it?
Well,
that's the obvious question, right?
Well, for us, like I said, we did it early on. We focused on it. We got, I think, sort of a jump on most people, and we discovered we were pretty good at it, and we made forged some good partnerships and allowed us to get some scale there. For us in the East Coast, it was also pretty natural because it's actually it was and still is cheaper for us to ship a container of beer from the East Coast to Europe than it is to send a truck across the country to the West Coast.
Yeah.
So we used to get a lot of flack for why are you selling beer in Sweden and Norway and everywhere else, and you're not sending it further west. And that was kind of the easy answer. Second thing is New York being such a global city and such an international city. We've got some like 60 million visitors a year come to New York, of whom I think roughly 15 million are from overseas. So we have just had this natural flow of traffic coming through, and as Brooklyn itself, not just the Brooklyn Brewery, but sort of the whole Brooklyn as a borough became really discovered, it was sort of a natural for us to then follow those visitors back overseas to their markets.
Yeah.
I'm curious to know more about the Canadian deal that you guys have coming up. Tell me about how that came together, who you're partnering with, what's going on there.
We are working actually with Sleeman up there to brew our beer for us. And I think we're through our second or third test brew and should be launching hopefully at the beginning of the year with them. So,
when you think about how the global markets will continue to evolve compared to how the U.S. market will evolve in the next 3 to 5 years, what's sort of your long-term vision for global craft, and how does it compare to what your vision might be here in the U.S. of how things will change?
well, I mean, I think there's a lot more room for growth in global craft right now than there is in domestic craft, just because they're a little further behind on that curve. That being said, I don't think that it's going to evolve differently over time internationally than it has here in the U.S. I mean, I don't think the days, the glory days, if you will, or the sort of the fantasy days where everybody was just growing 15-20% by just by hanging out a shingle. No offense to all the great breweries that developed doing that. We're not going to go back to that in this country. It's not going to happen again. We're not going to go back to 15-20% per year growth automatically for the craft beer segment. That's just It's just not realistic. I do think craft can continue to grow ahead of the overall segment. But I don't think that craft is going to go back to those heady growth days. Whereas in a lot of countries overseas, there are many years to come of that kind of growth. So we're happy to take advantage of that opportunity while it's there.
So if you see a future where in international markets there is the potential for at least a few years of double-digit growth, why do you also believe that the window has sort of closed for U.S. brewers to go capitalize on that?
Because there are now lots of locally established craft brewers already, and also the big U.S. craft brewers that are participating in that growth overseas are already there. And I just don't see a lot of window for new people to get in, like I said, in any kind of substantial way.
Yeah.
Overseas, you've got ABI with Goose Island as their craft flagship that they're pushing. Lagunitas obviously is paired up with Heineken. Ourselves we're working with Kirin and Carlsberg, and then you have BrewDog, who's a very capable competitor overseas as well. There are a few other smaller players doing something, but I mean those are really the four that I think are going to have the biggest growth. From as international craft brewers in the future.
Yeah. And then here domestically, I mean, if you can figure out what's going on in craft in the U.S., you should be awarded some sort of prize or maybe have a statue built or something like that.
Well, I think Andy provoked us well to, think about where we are going in this industry and, what it means to be a brewer and how we should be defining ourselves or not defining ourselves and thinking outside the traditional boundaries and, the blurring of the lines and lines we haven't thought of yet. But the biggest thing is that, I think the most salient part of Andy's presentation is that, I think you said it half jokingly and provokingly, but I think there's a lot of truth to it is, are we all sort of yearning for yesteryear and going after a declining segment? I think, Felipe, you also mentioned, the fact that, fast forward a couple years, sorry, Chris, I think you brought it up, fast forward a couple years and Caucasian is minority, not majority, and, that's a demographic that's coming, but no offense to all of us, but look at this room. I don't think we've figured out what that means yet and how to tackle that. I think we all have some deep soul searching to do, but more than anything, I just think we have to be willing to experiment and think outside the lines. You have to adapt to survive. You got to move with your consumer. I mean, that's sort of business 101, right? So if we don't do that, then we're all going to be fighting over a smaller pie.
So where's that experimentation take you domestically?
Like I said, non-alcoholic, I think is a whole new segment that's about to take off in this country. I think health and wellness we got to start looking at. I think, looking across categories at what other categories are doing. I think, wine and spirits have done a very good job of finding additional occasions to participate in. And I think as beer, we haven't done a very good job of that. I think we're still, by and large, focusing on the same traditional occasions, but haven't done a very good job at expanding that pie. I think we've got to start taking a couple of pages out of their playbook and trying to implement the same in reverse.
Yeah.
And to us, non-alcoholic that's one of the ways we look at it. It's not trying to focus on the relatively, right now non-alcoholic is like less than 0.5% of the of the total industry, and I'm not interested in going after some piece of that 0.5%. I'm interested in going after 10% or 20%, and expanding the number of beer occasions that are out there or occasions, I should say, out there that beer, whether it's alcoholic or non-alcoholic, can fit into.
What are some of those occasions?
Well, just a personal anecdote is we've been experimenting with this and, taking cases of our product home and just putting it in my fridge and just kind of watching myself, not to draw a line through one dot, but just watching myself and thinking about how I actually interact with the product. And I find myself reaching for it, a non-alcoholic beer, and all kinds of times that, hadn't really previously thought about it. You come back from the gym on a Sunday and I'd love a beer, but I don't really want an alcohol right then, and grab a non-alcoholic beer with the sandwich is perfect. Or I get home at the end of the day and don't really feel like alcohol that night, or maybe my wife doesn't want to drink for whatever reason, and I'll have a non-alcoholic beer, and it fits perfectly. I just think the more we have products that are approachable, that are delivering the flavor experience that we're looking for, I just think the more kind of occasions we're going to find. It's the first time as a craft brewer that we actually did any research. It was with AFB, and we spent like $150,000, which to us seems like a monumental amount of money when it comes to marketing. Kind of studying the market both overseas and in the U.S. And I think the most interesting thing that came out of that, the consumers were telling us that it's not that they were excited about products that would let them expand the number, sort of the occasions that they had where they could enjoy beer. Whether it was late at night, you've decided you've had enough, you got to drive, you've reached your limit, but you still want to be at the party, you still want to engage, you still want to be social, and it's a way of extending your night. It's not necessarily about not drinking and no alcohol. It's also a way of kind of being more responsible and being able to participate in social occasions without kind of feeling like you're being left out.
It's reframing a perspective around the non-alcoholic beer occasion.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, traditionally in the U.S. we've had it all backwards. It's been stigmatized. It's been, if you're drinking a non-alc, there was something wrong with you. And it was kept in the back of the the bar fridge and carefully poured into a glass and given to you, so nobody would see that you're drinking non-alcoholic beer. And it was kind of an embarrassing thing. Whereas you go in Europe and it's celebrated, it's treated the opposite in most countries. People would never sneer at you or look down at you like you've got a problem. They look at you like you're being responsible, or you're taking care of your health, or you've got other concerns. It's really treated very differently, and consequently, it's grown to be an appreciable part of the market. And I think actually that's an example where the beer industry has actually expanded the number of occasions where beer can be served. And I think we've been doing ourselves, a disservice in this country by treating it, differently. But hopefully we can turn that around.
Well, it sounds like a brewery's going to have to take a leadership position on reshaping the conversation around it then.
Absolutely, and I think we're not going to be able to do it ourselves. There are a number of small players, and Heineken launching their 0.0 with big fanfare, and Athletic Brewing Company. If you guys are here, I enjoyed one of your non-alcs at lunch earlier. I thought it was very good, and I think it's going to take a lot of people talking about it to start kind of changing the mindset of what non-alcoholic beer can be.
Is it sort of a generational change too that'll come with that, where millennials aren't drinking as much as they have in the past?
Oh, for sure. Well, I mean, I think that generational change is going to come on both ends, though. It's not just millennials and even our own generation that, as we start to age, want less alcohol but still want to be able to drink. The younger segment coming in, Gen Zers or Centennials, whatever they're calling them, a larger number of them, don't drink at all and are much more concerned in general about overall health and wellness. As was referenced earlier, it's much more about keeping it in control. I look at my own son who's finishing up in college this year, and still the amount of beer they drink seems absurd compared to what we drink, what I drink right now, but it's less absurd than it was before. So it's all relative, but there's absolutely truth in that being in control leading to a reduction in consumption. So I think, again, we have to look at what the consumer is telling us and make sure they're providing products that meet the lifestyle they want to live.
On the actual production side of those non-alcoholic brews that you mentioned, it seems like there'd be a pretty sort of steep learning curve in terms of dialing in recipe and process and putting out a finished product that still delivers a great experience, has a ton of flavor, but and mimics the actual experience of drinking an alcoholic beer because it is de-alcoholized. Like, it seems like there's a pretty steep ramp there.
There is a steep ramp. I mean, non-alcoholic beers have been made for a long time, so it's not new. There's a couple different ways that people have approached it in the past. Either essentially creating alcohol and then removing it, or trying not to create the alcohol in the first place. But we've been doing some research around a slightly different angle at it, and I think others are doing the same. And I think that the methods and techniques for developing non-alcoholic beer are going to continue to evolve for sure. I think it's just it's a little bit like cannabis, that because it was illegal hasn't been studied, and now that people are going to be able to study it, I think it's just a whole world's going to open up. And I think same thing with non-alcoholic beer.
Oh, people are studying it.
People are studying it now.
I'm
yes.
one of those people that's studying it.
I want to ask you how.
Yeah. A little bit, switching gears a little bit, away from sort of the product side and the innovation side and more towards the trade execution side. One of the ways you mentioned, sort of adapting to the current climate here in the U.S., one of the ways that you guys have adapted is through this national sales platform and through these investments in two other U.S. breweries, 21st Amendment and Funkwerks. How's that going, for our audience here that may be less familiar with it? What are you guys actually trying to accomplish with it? And, maybe what can other companies try to do similarly so that they can remain competitive and remain successful in such a crowded space?
Yeah, we've been looking at sort of the craft beer model, the more traditional model for a number of years now, and saying to us, this just isn't sustainable. The model is effectively broken. We're in this sort of arms race of field personnel, and you go in with one person in a state, and then the rep comes back to you and says, I'm outgunned 3-1. Like, you got to give me some more help. So you put in 2 more, and then they add 2 more, and before you know it, it just kind of keeps going up and up and up. And that's just not sustainable. I mean, there's too many of us reinventing the same wheel and trying to do the same thing, really inefficiently, if you will, and increasingly inefficiently as we go forward. And we have this great pinch point in our 3-tier system at the wholesale tier, and to a large extent, also at the retail tier, particularly when it comes to the off-premise channel. It's just sort of the law of math. I mean, there's only so many suppliers that wholesalers can effectively really pay attention to and deal with. And if we can come to them with a well thought out, well constituted portfolio representing several different brands at the same time, we've made their life a lot simpler. And same thing with the retailer. It also, to a certain extent, kind of improves your batting average. When you're talking to a retailer, you have multiple things to offer them in multiple categories. Now you have a much bigger, more important conversation. You're more relevant to them. They're more willing to give you the meeting. They're more willing to execute with you. So that's exactly what we tried to do when we put together the partnership with 21st Amendment and with Funkwerks, and we collapsed all the sales team together into one group, and now representing the three brands collectively. And like Dave Wilson, who's the president of 21st Amendment, said, this is a little bit of an experiment on Jan 1, 2018. We're going to flip on the lights in the warehouse, and we'll see how many actually go on. And I think a lot more went on than we thought we're going to. So, I'll almost say we got everything perfectly right, but I think we got most of it right, and so far it's been going pretty well. We set ourselves sort of 6 KPIs at the beginning of the year, 2 for each brand, and we're hitting 5 out of the 6, so not too bad.
Is there an appetite to expand that?
Yeah, we've had some interesting conversations with people. It doesn't work with just anybody. Both you've got to have the right fit in terms of who the founders are and what kind of style you have working with them. You have to have the right kind of geographic diversity in the portfolio. You have to have the right brand diversity in the portfolio. I think, as Felipe said earlier, you can't just show up with 10 IPAs. Because then they're basically going to tell you, well, which one do you want? So you have to have something that makes sense. And we put together kind of West Coast, East Coast. One's more can focused, one's more bottle focused and draft, one's more high end, and all different styles in our flagship. So it works. So adding more people into that, you have to look carefully at kind of where you are geographically and what kind of styles you have.
Between all of your partnerships, be it with Kirin or your JVs with some of the international craft partners or 21st Amendment or Funkwerks, you guys must have become experts at negotiating and forming these strategic alliances. So what's the secret to a good partnership?
It's going to sound really quaint and old-fashioned, but it's about the people. At the end of the day, people still make this world happen, and you have to have the right kind of compatibility. So we spend a lot of time getting to know the people, both sober and drunk, and understanding what they're all about to make sure that you've got kind of the same long-term vision and going to be able to work with these people. And I can also tell you the opposite. There are lots of people that we've talked to over the last 5 years when we were working on this that, after spending weeks, even months of discussions and being locked in conference rooms together and neutral meeting points and trying to figure out how we would make it work, we just at the end of the day concluded, appreciate the time we've all invested, but we're just fundamentally different people, and this just is not going to work. So that's really what it boils down to. And you can negotiate a legal contract and you can add hundreds of pages to it and try and think of every last single scenario and how it might play out, and you can drive yourself nuts doing that. And some of that you have to have, obviously, but at the end of the day, you have to have people you can work with because you're not going to be able to capture every last thing in a contract. And with a contract, if you ever have to go back to the contract, you're already in the wrong place. So hopefully it's something you pay the lawyers too much to do, and then you park it in a drawer and never have to look at it again.
I like that. Well, Eric, it's been great. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for making the trip all the way out here to record a podcast with us live in front of everyone.
There you go.
Thank you so
right.
much.
Thanks.
Cheers.
All right. See you guys.